August 12, 1944. 14,000 feet above the training ranges of California's Mojave Desert, where summer heat created thermals that made the air feel solid and unpredictable. Second Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, 18 years old, 3 weeks out of flight school, felt his P-38 lightning shudder as he entered the third practice stall of his advanced training flight. His instructor's voice crackled through the headset from another lightning circling above. "Recover cleanly. Watch your airspeed. Don't let it spin." But Hayes, pushing the stall too aggressively in his eagerness to demonstrate proficiency, felt the aircraft snap suddenly into a spin, both engines roaring at different power settings, the twin booms rotating around the central nacelle in a sickening corkscrew that sent the California desert spinning in his windscreen. The P-38 was notorious for this. Spin recovery was difficult, sometimes impossible if the pilot panicked or applied incorrect inputs. Hayes had been warned repeatedly that spinning a lightning could be fatal. His hands moved to the recovery controls, throttles to idle, stick forward to break the stall, rudder opposite to the spin, but in his inexperience, he made an error. He advanced one throttle while retarding the other, creating asymmetric thrust that should have made the spin worse. Instead, something unexpected happened. The Lightning's rotation rate increased dramatically, the nose dropped, and suddenly the aircraft was no longer spinning but rolling. A violent, accelerated roll that Hayes could control. Within 2 rotations, he had the Lightning stable again, climbing back to altitude. His heart hammering, but his mind racing with the realization that he had stumbled onto something that would, 6 months later, save his life and change American fighter tactics in the European theater. By the summer of 1944, the P-38 Lightning had established itself as a formidable long-range fighter in the Pacific, where its twin-engine reliability and heavy armament made it ideal for operations over vast oceanic distances. But in Europe, the Lightning had struggled against German fighters, particularly the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109, which were more maneuverable in turning combat and could exploit the P-38's relative sluggishness in tight turns. American pilots had learned to use the Lightning's speed and firepower to make high-speed passes rather than engage in dogfights, to avoid situations where German fighters could bring their superior roll rates and turn performance to bear. The tactical doctrine was clear. If outnumbered, if caught in a disadvantageous position, dive away using the Lightning's superior speed. Never try to turn with German fighters. The mathematics of wing loading and power-to-weight ratios dictated that such engagements would end badly for the heavier American aircraft. Hayes, after recovering from his training spin and landing back at base, mentioned the asymmetric throttle technique to his instructor, almost as an afterthought. The instructor, a combat veteran recently returned from the Mediterranean theater, immediately recognized the significance. A controlled spin, or more accurately, a violent rolling descent that simulated a spin while maintaining control, could confuse pursuing fighters, could create angles and opportunities that standard evasive maneuvers could not achieve. More critically, it could allow a P-38 to reverse direction rapidly, to convert defensive flight into offensive positioning through a maneuver that enemy pilots would not anticipate because it appeared suicidal. The technique was documented, analyzed by test pilots at Wright Field, refined through repeated practice, and quietly distributed to P-38 squadrons in Europe with a cautionary note that it required precise execution and should only be attempted by pilots thoroughly familiar with their aircraft's characteristics. Hayes arrived in England in November 1944, assigned to the 55th Fighter Group based at Wormingbeer, joining a squadron that had been flying P-38s since early in the war, and had accumulated the kind of combat experience that made young replacement pilots feel simultaneously awed and inadequate. The veterans treated him with professional courtesy tinged with skepticism. He was 18, looked younger, and had the kind of fresh-faced enthusiasm that combat either hardened or destroyed within the first few missions. They taught him the real lessons that training had omitted: how to manage fuel consumption on long-range escorts, how to identify German fighters at maximum visual range, how to position himself for mutual support, how to stay alive long enough to become useful. Hayes absorbed everything, flew his missions with competent caution, and waited for the moment that would test whether his accidental discovery in the California desert had any value in combat. That moment came on January 14th, 1945, during a bomber escort mission deep into Germany. Hayes was flying tail-end position in his four-plane flight when five Bf-109s, diving from altitude, engaged the formation. The attack was coordinated, aggressive, executed by veterans who understood how to use altitude advantage and numerical superiority. Hayes's flight leader called the break, standard defensive maneuver, turn into the attackers, deny them firing angles, maintain formation integrity. But the Bf-109s anticipated this. They split their attack, two engaging the lead elements while three went after Hayes, cutting him off from his wingman, forcing him into a defensive turn that bled airspeed and altitude. Within 30 seconds, Hayes found himself exactly where P-38 pilots were trained never to be. Slow, alone, with multiple German fighters maneuvering for firing positions. The lead Bf-109 settled onto Hayes's tail at 400 yards, closing rapidly. Standard doctrine prescribed diving away, using the P-38's speed to disengage. But Hayes was below 10,000 feet with insufficient altitude to build the speed necessary to outrun pursuit. The German pilot was experienced, positioning himself perfectly, waiting for the optimal firing range. Hayes felt the lightning wallowing at low speed, felt the controls growing mushy as airspeed dropped toward dangerous levels. And then he remembered the California desert, the accidental spin, the technique that instructors had been skeptical about but had allowed him to practice because he could demonstrate it reliably. He pulled the nose up sharply, induced an accelerated stall, and simultaneously advanced his right throttle to full power while pulling the left throttle to idle. The P-38 snapped into what appeared to be an uncontrolled spin, exactly the kind of violent departure from controlled flight that typically preceded a crash. The German pilot, seeing his target apparently lose control, held his fire and pulled up slightly to avoid debris from what he assumed would be an imminent ground impact. But Hayes was not out of control. He was rolling, using asymmetric thrust to accelerate the rotation, converting a stall into a violent maneuver that reversed his heading in less than 3 seconds. As the Lightning completed its second rotation, Hayes leveled the wings, equalized throttles, and found himself pointing at the scattered formation of Bf-109s from an angle they had not anticipated. The symbolic object that defined Hayes's combat innovation was neither weapon nor instrument, but something more fundamental: the throttle quadrant itself. Specifically, the ability to manipulate both throttles independently, to create asymmetric thrust that single-engine fighters could not replicate. Throughout his training accident and subsequent combat application, those two throttles represented the unique characteristic of twin-engine fighters, a feature that conventional doctrine treated as merely redundancy for reliability rather than as a tactical tool. Hayes had discovered that asymmetry could be weaponized, that the complexity of managing two engines could be transformed from a burden into an advantage if the pilot understood how to exploit the differential thrust for maneuverability, rather than simply for straight-line performance. The Germans' pilots, trained to fight single-engine opponents where predictable physics governed turning radius and roll rates, found themselves facing a maneuver that violated their understanding of how American fighters could behave. The P-38 that had been fleeing at low speed had suddenly reversed into an attacking position through a maneuver that looked like a fatal spin, but was actually controlled aggression. Hayes, capitalizing on the confusion, closed to 300 yards and fired a burst at the nearest Bf-109. The German pilot, still processing what he had witnessed, reacted a half-second too slowly. The P-38's concentrated firepower, 4 50-caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, struck the Bf-109's engine, and the German fighter began trailing smoke. The remaining 4 Bf-109s, seeing their formation broken and one of their aircraft damaged by a target that should have been helpless, reassessed. They had superior numbers, superior position, and by all conventional measures should have been pressing their advantage. But the P-38 pilot had demonstrated capabilities they had not anticipated, had used a maneuver they did not understand, had converted certain defeat into a situation where predictability no longer applied. The psychological impact of the unknown, of facing a tactic that training had not prepared them for, outweighed the tactical mathematics of 5 against 1. The German formation leader made a decision that experience dictated, When facing unpredictable opponents with unknown capabilities, conserve resources rather than risk additional casualties. He ordered his remaining pilots to break off, to climb away and rejoin, to abandon the engagement. Hayes watched them go, his own fuel gauge indicating he had perhaps 15 minutes before reaching critical levels, his aircraft undamaged, his survival achieved through a technique he had discovered accidentally 8 months earlier in a training flight that should have been routine. When Hayes landed at Wormingbeer and debriefed the engagement, his squadron commander listened with intense interest. The asymmetric spin recovery, which Hayes had begun calling the rolling stall turn, was analyzed, documented, and practiced by other pilots in the unit. Within weeks, multiple P-38 pilots had used variations of the technique in combat, exploiting the maneuver's ability to create sudden reversals that German fighters could not anticipate. The transformation was not revolutionary. It did not suddenly make the P-38 superior in turning combat, but it provided a tactical option that had not existed before, a way to convert desperate situations into survivable ones through a maneuver that used the aircraft's twin-engine configuration as an advantage rather than merely a reliability feature. What German pilots expected when engaging P-38 Lightnings was predictable behavior based on known performance characteristics: superior speed, inferior maneuverability, tendency to disengage through diving acceleration. What they experienced in early 1945 was an increasing number of encounters where American pilots used asymmetric thrust techniques to create unpredictable maneuvers, where the conventional wisdom about how twin-engine fighters behaved proved insufficient, where tactical advantages that had existed for years suddenly became unreliable. The transformation was psychological as much as tactical. Uncertainty about enemy capabilities erodes confidence, makes pilots hesitant, creates the kind of mental burden that affects decision-making in combat. Hayes flew 37 more combat missions before the war ended in May 1945. He survived them all, scored 4 confirmed victories, and accumulated enough experience to transition from the youngest pilot in his squadron to a formation leader teaching newly arrived replacements the techniques that kept people alive. His accidental discovery in the California desert had evolved into doctrine, had been analyzed by tacticians, had been incorporated into training programs, had saved pilots he would never meet in engagements he would never know about. The 18-year-old cadet, who had spun a P-38 during a training exercise, had stumbled onto a truth that experienced pilots had missed: that aircraft characteristics considered limitations could be transformed into advantages if someone was willing to think beyond established doctrine, to explore the edges of the performance envelope where conventional wisdom had never ventured. The asymmetric throttles that Hayes had manipulated in panic during his training spin represented more than mechanical controls. They represented the advantage that comes from treating complexity as opportunity rather than burden, from exploring rather than avoiding the margins of capability, from recognizing that the best innovations sometimes emerge from mistakes analyzed rather than errors concealed. The American military system that allowed a teenage pilot to document an unconventional technique, that analyzed it rather than dismissing it, that distributed it to combat units within months rather than suppressing it as a dangerous deviation from established procedure. This system exemplified the advantage democratic militaries possessed over authoritarian opponents. Ideas flowed upward as well as downward. Junior officers could contribute to doctrine. Accidents could be transformed into innovations if the culture valued learning over blame. In the end, Hayes's rolling stall turn was not the decisive technique that won the air war over Europe. That victory was achieved through overwhelming numbers, superior logistics, technological advantages, and the accumulated effect of thousands of tactical innovations large and small. But his contribution represented something more profound than a single maneuver. It represented the advantage that comes from a system that trusts its youngest members to think creatively, that analyzes failures as learning opportunities, that moves new knowledge from training accident to combat doctrine with a speed that rigid hierarchies could never match. The 18-year-old who had almost died in a training spin had discovered a trick that changed how a small number of American pilots fought, and in doing so, had demonstrated the larger truth that wars are won not just by those with better equipment, but by those who create systems allowing innovation to emerge from any source, at any rank, and spread throughout their forces faster than enemies can adapt.